Hello everybody, and welcome back to yet another video, and to the first episode of a brand new series, the Cars Adventures Rewatch podcast. In this series, Robin Tailsfighter and I are going to be going back through my entire Cars Adventures series and rewatching all of it. Now Robin, you have rewatched Cars Adventures several times, that's why you're here. I always joke that you know more about the series than I do. This is my first time fully rewatching the series. I used to make Cars Adventures daily, sometimes multiple episodes a day, and it got very ridiculous very fast because I was young and didn't really know what I was doing. It takes about a year for Cars Adventures to get decent, so these first few episodes are going to be a lot of us suffering, but if you've never watched the Cars Adventures series before, this could be a fun way to hear what happens in some of the earlier seasons without having to go through the torture of watching them yourself.
It starts getting good when the seasons hit the double digits.
Yeah. So for these first few episodes, we're probably going to be complaining quite a bit, but sit back, relax, probably do something else. There's not going to be much on screen here. Since it's supposed to be a podcast. I'll probably just be putting up the thumbnails of each respective episode as we talk about them. So the way this is going to be formatted, we're gonna talk about each episode, then we'll just give general thoughts on the season, and then we both came up with a top 3 list. Both of us wrote our top 3 favorite episodes, so we'll share that. But yeah, I'm just going to be putting like the thumbnails of each episode up as we talk about them. This is before I can make my own thumbnails, so they're just YouTube's, like, auto-generated thumbnails that just take a random screenshot, which is how we got this rather iconic image of Wheel Action Driver Sarge as the first ever thumbnail. So, Episode 1, Carburetor Crash. I guess we'll start with a brief plot recap. Cars Adventures, Episode 1, Carburetor Crash, came out when, I think it was like September 3rd of 2017.
Something like that.
Whole season ended on like October 1st, but like 6, 7, 8 episodes were released in one day later on. We'll get to that. Carburetor Crash features Lightning and Sally, and they're going for a drive in Radiator Springs when all of a sudden they see that Mater is hanging off the edge of Carburetor Canyon, aka my dresser.
Let's say he's calmly hanging off.
Very calmly.
He's calm.
He's weirdly not freaking out. He's weirdly okay with it. And Sally pulls out her lucky string, which is just a massive ball of string, and that's how they hope to get Mater up. Most of the episode...
And they hang it all the way across the town.
Yeah, because it's just a regular-sized string. Most of the episode is about the two of them tying different cars to the string, including Guido and the King, for some reason. I think my line of thinking was that the King's front is kind of a slope, so maybe he could pull Mater back up. Eventually, I think they tie the string to each other, and they get Mater, but they accidentally fall into the tractor field, and oh no, they wake up Frank, but takes Frank
takes forever to wake up.
So they get away. Also,
and we don't actually see them get away. It's just, and it suddenly cuts to them saying, "I'm not talking to you," and
Sally and Lightning claim that they've broken up. Sure, okay.
A lot of your decisions, like a lot of the points that I've written down about these episodes in the first season, just come down to, why the heck did you do this?
Right, exactly.
Including that scene.
Why? Because that was never touched on again. Really.
It's literally solved in the next episode.
Lightning and Sally breaking up should be a massive conflict. Nope.
We already had a massive conflict. We don't need to.
So what other notes do you have for this episode?
Guido only says pit stop, but that goes for generally the first couple seasons.
Yeah, I think that's a mistake a lot of people make in Cars videos. All Guido says is pit stop, even when it's not relevant. Guido speaks some other English. He speaks full Italian, but like
It's kind of like like Groot saying "I am Groot," but it meaning different things. And
Exactly.
in this case, Pete Stop.
It's just pit stop again and again and again. Um, the other thing that we need to address now as a general issue for the season, everything is really cluttered. You could even see in the thumbnail. My room was a mess. I didn't have any place to display my cars, and later on in the season, you actually see where I ended up storing my cars on 2 separate occasions in the background. I was really bad at just cleaning the area where Radiator Springs was supposed to be. Radiator Springs also gets completely wrecked in this episode, and nobody seems to care because they're swinging Guido around on a string. I think I just realized
They start caring about where where everything is in like episode 10.
exactly. So I filmed a few, I guess you could call them pilots, a few different episodes that were supposed to be the start of the series, and one such episode featured the Lemons kidnapping Finn. This has never been released publicly. I don't have the footage anymore. And he's covered in string, and that's how he's tied up. And I thought, gee, that's so fun. Let's do that for this episode that I ended up releasing. So it just seems like me realizing, hey, I could tie string to my cars. Look how fun this is. I'm going to throw Guido around. Whee!
Yeah, look at Guido. He's having the time of his life.
Also, the king just spontaneously appears. That's a massive issue in early episodes. It's just characters just showing up for literally no relevant reason. And,
yeah, we'll get into more about that later during other episodes.
I think one of the worst examples of that is the second episode. If you're ready to move to episode 2, Lucky String, and announcement at the end.
Yeah, okay, let's move on.
So, in this episode, Lightning and Sally are now stuck together with the Lucky String. And
after they've broken up.
Right. So they're kind of mad at each other. Hijinks ensue, and they have to find a way to undo, not undo, but to get the string separated. These include asking Flo to cut the string because her fins are sharp, or they look like they'd be sharp, and then I proceed to just flip Flo sideways and saw with her. What are some other things they do? They go to
they drop the sign on top of Lizzie's head roof. They drop that on the string.
Right.
It seems almost like you were actually trying to cut it with all these different types of things, and it just didn't work.
I think I was getting vaguely sharp things. They go to a construction site where you see some construction vehicles, and also Yeti, the abominable snowplow, because apparently that's a construction vehicle. Taco. This is before
Crazy 8 Crusher Taco.
This is before I had regular Taco. So yeah, he's there too. They hired Jerome Ramp, the lemon with a torch. I think this is really the first example of a Cars Adventures character not playing themselves, but this is an issue we see all throughout the season.
It's not the first. Yeah, it is the first example. Never mind.
It's an issue all throughout the season. Nowadays in Cars Adventures, background characters are reused time and time again. I only have so many cars. But in the early series, I did that. You'll see when the lemons start to show up, I only had like 3 lemons at the time. You gotta understand how small my collection was when I was starting the series. Nowadays, I could have a whole army of lemons, but back in early 2017, when my channel was only a month old, I didn't. So the lemons have like rusty cars and demolition derby cars.
We'll get into that when it's relevant, okay?
Yeah, it's.
Let's not get ahead of ourselves.
It's a whole mess. But here, Jerome. I'm saying this now because Jerome Ramp here isn't evil. But then later on, they have references to when he helped them break the string. So.
Yeah. Okay.
Do we
so
say...
yeah, of course, at the end, then they're going to Thunder Hollow. They're trying to break the demolition derby, and the fact that they're attached to each other with a string that's seen as cheating. So Roscoe or Ty's fingers cut the string with scissors.
Right. I don't think regular.
Which is weird if you consider that they literally dropped a building on it and it didn't break. So scissors work?
Right, but it's literally just my hand and a human-sized pair of scissors. Because one of the biggest issues the whole season has is me just disregarding the fact that these are toy cars. Like, you're not invested. It feels too much like, oh, here comes a hand to cut the but don't worry, it's Roscoe, it's fine. There are a ton of references to characters that I didn't own or aren't there. The worst one is also in this episode. They yell, Dusty, drop the sign when they're going to drop Lizzie's sign.
That makes zero sense.
What? I was just saying a name of a Cars character.
A Plate's character.
Right. So episode 3 is called Mater the Greater Rides Again.
It's the only thing that has relevance to the previous episodes is that because he was hanging there, Mater realized he could be Mater the Greater again, and other than that, it's just Mater doing a bunch of random stunts.
Yeah.
In the end, he dropped out of a helicopter from near space, which would not be possible.
Right.
And McQueen puts rockets on him, goes to save him, and lands nicely without crashing himself.
Right. This is one of the best.
That's a good summary of the episode, right?
Yeah, this is one of the best examples
and Fillmore's house gets turned into a ramp.
So Fillmore's house in early Cars Adventures was made out of a ramp. It was a ramp. It was a ramp from the Hydro Wheels line that was kind of greenish in color. And here, once again, I just disregard the fact that I treat them like toys instead of like parts of the universe. Because Mater picks it up and flips it over and uses it as a ramp. He also puts that ramp in Luigi's, and there's a terrible joke where Luigi goes, Mater calls it the Casa della Ramp, and Luigi goes, no, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't translate well. That just means House of Ramp.
Yeah.
Anything else we should bring up for this? I think this one is it's just an episode that makes zero sense in the context of the episodes around it. I think this might be the best of the early episodes. Very early, because at least it has a start and a finish that make sense. It has dumb stuff in it, but
yeah.
Now episode 4 is called Spy Story. And
it takes place before the first episode.
Right, so Mater reveals how he ended up hanging off the edge. And it's so funny, because that means that
It's so stupid. It's stupid because
all of these episodes happened on the same day.
Yeah, because the lemons are near Radiator Springs for whatever reason, which... Why would they be there? And so are the spies.
Right, and they're fighting.
The spies and the lemons fight a bit, and then eventually they end up on Carburetor Canyon above Radiator Springs. And Professor Z, or should I say, Dr. Z.
Dr. Z.
he pushes Mater off the edge eventually,
right.
And then just gets out of there, and then apparently Mater's tow cable is like super strong, so Sidley can't even cut it.
Sidley, portrayed by one of the military planes from the first Cars, because I don't have a Sidley.
The second example of characters not being themselves.
Right. But I think there's a fourth wall break about that later in the season.
Yeah.
This has one of the worst things in the entire show, which is the time I accidentally reused 2 takes of the same scene back to back. I talked about that in My Errors and Inconsistencies, which was a subscriber special I did a few years ago, just breaking down mistakes I've made in videos. But turns out Professor Z has a twin brother named Dr. Z, who was pretending to be him here.
It actually comes back at is season. I don't even remember. It gets referenced at some point in season 28 or something.
Does it? Because Professor Z never shows up in the Cars Adventure series after this season, other than in a season when Mater is writing a fake story.
The zombie story, yeah.
Yeah.
It gets referenced somewhere at some points by the Lemons.
Yeah.
Lab 2.
So
that's a long way away from this.
Yeah, I don't want to confuse people. This season confuses people enough, thank you. The next episode is called Cruises Crash, and it may have to take the cake for the worst episode of the entire show.
Yeah, I can 100% agree with. Well, it's worst episode that is canon. Let's put it at that.
Right. So, at the time, there were no next gens out other than Jackson, Tim, and Danny. So,
Cruz.
and Cruz. So, how did I fill out the ranks of the Piston Cup? Well, I used veterans, and I think to this day that was still a perfectly okay decision to use Piston Cup veterans.
You even have an explanation somewhere in season 2 or season 3 for that.
Yeah, I think it's actually at the end of this season. We'll get to that. But then I also included random World Grand Prix racers and some of the tuners.
And the Demolition Derby cars. Should I just go ahead and just say the entire episode? Because
yeah, there's not really much of a plot to this one other than...
in the beginning, they make it very obvious that Tim Treadless has something planned.
Yes.
Because literally the announcers say, like, Tim Treadless has something planned, and something like, I hope he's not cheating. So what does Tim do? He proceeds to immediately start crashing other cars, beginning with Cruz, who he crashes twice, and who then continues to crash for the rest of the entire race.
For the entire race, we keep cutting back.
She keeps
Cruz.
Bouncing up and down everywhere throughout the stadium.
Just going around like she's made of rubber. At one point, the Lightyear blimp crashes, and she bounces off of it again and again and again and again.
Yeah, and you will not believe who wins.
Isn't it Superfly?
It's Superfly, yeah. Because Jackson and Tim are like neck and neck, and then when they're driving towards the finish line, and suddenly Superfly flies past them. Which is so weird. So the first ever Piston Cup race in Cars Adventures was won by a Demolition Derby car.
Yeah. I know you told me before we started the call you have a problem with the copious amounts of slow motion in this episode.
It is terrible. Also, not to forget, like, half the episode has the same iMovie background music playing on loop.
I think maybe there's a reason why I don't use music in Cars Adventures anymore. Season 1 has some music in it, and it's never situationally appropriate, and this entire episode has the same track on loop, exactly. There's a bunch of slow-mo with stupid tags.
And not to forget, the intro for each episode was some kind of postcard on a board with whatever the episode. That was for like the first 10 episodes until you got a proper intro.
Yeah. The slow motion has stupid labels on it that break the fourth wall and are like, oh, this is so funny. Oh, my screaming slow down is so funny. It's like, no.
It's one of the worst episodes ever, yet it is also the beginning of what essentially sets the stage for the next 32 seasons.
Exactly.
And even the effects of that episode are still around now in Lab 3.
Exactly. So episode 6 is called Rise of the Lemons Part 1. And in all honesty, this is one of my least favorite episodes. First off, it's almost 10 minutes. And this episode didn't do well when it came out. I barely had any viewers, but it performed a lot lower than all my other videos. It is the reason why, to this day, I don't title episodes Part 1, Part 2. For some reason, they always get less views if I title them Part 1, Part 2. This was also the reason why I strayed away from doing episodes longer than 10 minutes until very, very recently.
Honestly, but like it's not really a great episode, but it starts off what is like the only decent plot throughout this entire season.
So the Lemons, decent plot, but terrible execution.
A plot that actually makes sense. Let's put it like that.
The Lemons are going, the Acer and Grem try to invade Radiator Springs, hijinks ensue, it's all very dark, it's very hard to see what's going on, and it's kind of slow and boring, but
wants to put Professor Z in the blender.
Alright, so Flo's roof, the part, if you know the original Flo's playset, which I still use to this day, it opens up, and in each episode, what it is changes. One time it's a sunroof. In this episode, it's a freezer. And in another episode, it's a blender.
Yeah, it's just. I mean, the fact that they put Professor Z in the freezer is kind of funny. It actually starts out with a fight with the spies against the Lemons, and the Lemons being made up of all the Lemons you owned, as well as a few of the Demolition Derby cars.
Because they look
At some point, speaking of random character appearances, at some point, T-Bone is threatening Finn, then randomly Miss Fritter drops out of the sky on top of him, taking him down, and then just drives off and literally does not. And then T-Bone just attacks Finn again.
T-Bone's like, he says, I think, like, oh, this is worse than anything that ever happened at the Demolition Derby. And then Miss Fritter comes out of the sky and crushes him. And Finn's like, oh, thanks, Miss Fritter. And she's like, yeah, like no problem, bro.
Later in the season, she actually appears. Yeah, we'll get that there.
Yeah, so honestly, I hate this episode. I really do. The one interesting concept it introduces is the concept of the Lemons taking the townies one by one and capturing them and putting them in a prison called the Bin, which is just a Tupperware container.
I mean, it's not a bad name for a prison.
I like it. I like this concept, but once again, it kind of gets squandered, and we'll get to that. Yeah. The next episode is called Demo.
Also, there's a crane with the Lemons, and he never shows up with them again.
Yeah. In the series, I did a Cars series before I started YouTube, and the crane was actually the villain, so I think that's why. Also, it should be noted that this episode is the first appearance of Lubewig, and the first ever I like popsicles joke.
It's the first episode that introduces a reoccurring joke.
Which somehow is still going to this day. I didn't realize that it started this early on. The origin of that is, in 2014, I used to film Cars videos just for fun, and I did one with a friend of mine, and he wanted to play as Lubewig, and he'd just have him go, or he'd go like, nom nom popsicles! So somehow, that series, I haven't spoken to him in about 5 years, but somehow, that has stayed on YouTube.
Yeah.
So,
moving on to the next episode, after the spies as well as Guido and Luigi get captured in episode 6, the townies are kind of stressed out, and Lightning tries to make things easier by telling us a story about him being in a demolition derby, which was supposed to be like similar to Mater's. McQueen was supposed to be McQueen's Tall Tales, except he's actually been in a demolition derby. So how much of a tall tale is it really?
Well, this is different than the one that we see in Cars 3. When I was about to rewatch,
but still, it's not entirely. It's still
inaccurate.
Stupid concepts.
When I was about to rewatch this episode, I was honestly kind of excited. I was like, oh wait, I don't remember this one. I'm sure this one's fun. It's not. Once again, random cars placed there because there weren't enough Demolition Derby cars out. What keeps happening is everyone gets knocked down, and then they just get back up again, okay? Every single time. No one's ever knocked out for good because I did not know what I was doing. I didn't know how it was going to end. The one thing I think is funny is Ramon doesn't believe him, and Lightning goes, you remember, you were there too, and so Ramon is there now.
It's kind of it was actually an episode that I cringed, and so I kind of skipped half of it.
So yeah, this is one of the most boring somehow. So why is this episode here? Well, it's because I was waiting to get 10 subscribers so I could release the grand finale, Rise of the Lemons Part 3. And I assume I threw this in as filler while I was waiting. Rise of the Lemons Part 2 comes next, and I don't really remember this one, despite having just watched it yesterday. Is this the one where...
I actually like this. This is probably my favorite of the Rise of the Lemons episodes.
I think it's probably...
It just basically shows how the Lemons and the Thunder Hollow cars who work with them for whatever reason, how they slowly capture all of the townies. Some of the reasons are kind of stupid, but it's actually kind of makes sense in a story. It's actually not an episode on its own. It's just continuing the story. So it's the first ever Cars Adventure episode that actually makes sense.
Yeah. So the Lemons, I think we see each day of the week, and the Lemons capture them one by one. Also, a string returns with there being a big taser across the town. Sarge has a boot camp, and Bud, the RV, is there for some reason. Also,
boot camp once again uses Fillmore's house as a ramp.
Yes. Smokey is there in Radiator Springs.
He randomly comes there claiming he wanted to be more like Dog, which also makes no sense.
Does he say that? At this,
Yeah, like throughout my years, I've never been as much like Dog or something like that.
that's weird. Okay, well, he never returned. He doesn't live in Radiator Springs and Cars Adventures. But you know who
He,
does, at least
I'm
here?
not even sure if he appeared in any of the following episodes in the Rise of the Lemon finale parts.
Yeah, I don't know if they even freed him. I don't remember. But Cruz. Everyone wants Cruz to rest. She's in the cozy cone, which is just one cone poorly made of cardboard. Thank you. They want Cruz to rest because she just had a crash, but everyone's getting captured. Somehow except her. You think she'd be the easiest to capture because she crashed and can't move.
She was actually hiding in the cone. So when I'm pretty sure Fishtail takes the last of the townies away, he says, "We'll come back for you next," because that's the moment when she actually comes out of the cone.
Oh, okay.
So then we go on to the 10 subscriber special video,
Wow.
Cars Adventures Episode 9, Rise of the Lemons, Part 3.
Cruz teams up with Mac and Cal and Bobby, their debut in the series,
Sidley.
and Sidley, to free everybody. And there's a big old fight. This ends the Rise of the Lemons arc. The Lemons are not addressed again in this season. And the funny thing is, in a trailer I released for this season, they were supposed to be way more significant. There's like an old trailer I released where Finn talks about how like the townies have to become spies to take down the Lemons. Now we just don't see the Lemons again for the rest of this season.
We get this episode gets the first big fight in Cars Adventures.
Right. We also
because it's one army of all the townies and Holly and Finn and then the racers.
Right.
You with the racers and then against Lemons and the Thunder Hollow cars. This is also the reason. This scene is also the reason why the Thunder Hollow cars are actually evil later on in the series.
They teamed up with the Lemons here to, quote, take over the world. It's not explained why, just because they look old and rusty.
It is. Also, how are you going to take over the world with a handful of lemons and a bunch of demolition derby cars? So
exactly.
Later in the series, when they actually have semi-realistic goals, or at least semi-realistic means of getting to their goals. Episode, in the beginning, it's just what every little kid would play with their lemons.
Right. The one other thing I need to address is one joke that honestly I think is kind of funny. And Lizzie, who is in the fight because she gets freed, threatens that the ghost of Stanley will attack them. And whatever car she's fighting starts laughing, and all of a sudden the Stanley statue comes out of the sky and crushes them. And it's never addressed again. I think the Stanley statue shows up.
The only addressing is that one car, like Ramon or Lightning, one of them says, "Is nobody gonna talk about how weird that is?"
Yeah,
and that literally sums up my thoughts on that scene.
And then I think it comes up again later on in the season, later on in the episode, because
because Stanley does it again.
Once again, it was just something that I had in my room at the time, and that was it. That was the joke. That was all.
And then we go on to the next episode, episode 10, Danny Broke.
So with Rise of the Lemons over, we get Danny Broke, and I thought this episode was really clever at the time. Danny Swervez.
It's actually the name, at least. It's the first
pun
name of an episode that's actually a joke.
Yeah, which is pretty common nowadays. The plot is that Danny Swervez is just a big old mean guy. He's really mean to his hauler. He threatens to cut his hauler's pay, which I don't think he has control over. And he ends up stranded in Radiator Springs, close to his race. The rest of the episode is a parody of the first Cars movie, or kind of a redo.
With Lightning literally telling the other townies, "Do to him what you did to me."
Exactly. And it works!
So he paves the roads
with Frank.
And he goes on a drive with Sally, which makes no sense. And he goes tractor tipping.
And it ends with him saying, "Hey, do you know what time Luigi's opens?" And that's where it ends. So after this,
that part is actually like kind of makes sense to end it on. So yeah.
So it shows that
thinks that Luigi starts screaming and then it cuts off.
I think it's Guido, yeah, but it shows that Danny has learned. And in the next episode, You Cruise, You Lose, you see just how nice Danny is now. He's super nice now to everybody.
This is also the first. The first sign of the conflict that goes on throughout the series. was of course with the first crash of Cruz Ramirez, but here we actually start to see the beginning of what would be make both sides away, start both sides, because Danny becomes one of the good next gens because of this episode.
Yeah, so Danny becomes a good guy. The rest of the next gens are just shown as being really mean and just total jerks. You saw what Tim did.
Oh, we'll get into there in later seasons.
Yeah,
we're starting with her, but that's going to be in like 2 seasons.
I simply thought we would make the next gens were probably all evil because Jackson Storm was. No, they're just regular racers. Thank you. And you cruise, you lose. Cruz, I mark this as the most important episode of the first season. Cruz, after her crash, and this one was actually like competently made, unlike Cruz's crash. At this point, I think I'm starting to get the hang of the series a bit more. I think there was a bit of a gap in release between episodes 10 and 11. And at this point, I'm starting to get the hang of it more, telling stories that I think are a bit better planned out and just don't just have random things popping up at random places.
Yeah, sort of.
It's getting a little better, just slightly. And you cruise, you lose. Has Cruz have this awful losing streak? It's so
Which
bad.
also makes sense because she is still fast. Why is she all of a sudden slow? Is it her own confidence or what? Because that's never addressed.
Nobody knows. Well, she's so bad that she ends up being fired from Dynaco and replaced with Sally as their new racer.
It's pretty much what my biggest issue with the episode was, that they complain about people are no longer buying Dynaco because you're losing races, which I don't think
dumb.
makes sense, because you do it to promote the brand. That's true, but once people start buying from the brand, they're not going to stop just because the racer who races for that brand is doing terrible.
It was very weak. I didn't like Cruz much when I first saw Cars 3. So I guess I just wanted to like come up with an interesting storyline where we do something with her, not necessarily write her out. At the time, my idea wasn't, oh, Sally should have taken over in the movie. No, of course not. That's dumb. I thought it would just be an interesting story to tell here. Because why not? Lightning later on confesses that he thinks that he was the one who decided.
That's later in the season. That's later in the season.
Yeah. But I just want to say Tex is wildly out of character here with how rude he is, and so was Lightning later on when he's like, oh, I decided that I wanted Sally to race instead of Cruz. It's like, dude, you're a jerk for doing that. And
I mean, Lightning in later seasons, Lightning actually shows regret for that decision, so you salvage that part pretty well.
Yeah, no, I fixed that part. In season 32, there's a flashback episode that shows like the actual reasoning behind it. So afterwards, we have Cruz's new job. In this episode, Cruz gets a new job. She's officially out as the Dynaco racer, and she needs to be unmodified. So we see the tuners for the first ever time, just in a gag where...
Second ever time, because 2 of them raced in the first Piston Cup race.
Where just in a gag where Wingo has to unmodify Cruz.
He has his editing, his paint, his tuner work tingling thingy, something with that.
Right. He feels a disturbance in the body modification and paint universe or something. I think that's the line.
Yeah.
As if a million voices cried out in terror and were suddenly silenced. And those million voices are the viewers of Card's Adventures. So Wingo...
There's not even a million people have seen it, but yeah.
No. Not even close. Anyway, Cruz gets a new job at Revolting Burger. Which, yes, for those of you who've only seen the most recent season, Revolting Burger is from the first ever season. I just thought it was funny. And in classic season 1 fashion...
It occasionally returns throughout the entire series.
In classic season 1 fashion, it's over-explained why it's funny that it's called Revolting. I over-explain every joke. Anyway, she deals with a few different customers. None of them are funny, but yeah. She gets fired.
Did she rage quit or did she get fired?
I want to say Dave Alternators or Davey Apex, whatever. I think he fires her. Then
Davey,
we have
you call him Davey throughout this series.
So then we have Missing Cup.
That was just Yokoza stealing Lightning's cup, and then they end up Lightning follows them on a plane without even seeing anywhere that they're going to Tokyo.
Yeah. So,
This is the first of several times when they casually travel to Tokyo, which is on the other side of the Pacific.
Exactly. Yeah, so Yokoza steals Lightning's piston cup.
Well, technically, he bought it from Lizzie, who thought it was just an old junk
And
thing.
No. She found it in Lightning's cone, in the cozy cone. And what I think is great is she says, I thought it belonged to some other car, so I decided to sell it. It's like, gee, Lizzie, you were selling someone's personal belongings regardless. But okay.
Yeah, and then let's go straight on into episode 14, Drift Race in Japan.
This is the second part of Missing Cup, in which Lightning does a drift race in Japan. And for several shots, you could just see all of my collection. Now, as of Missing Cup, Radiator Springs changed location. That's probably what's most important to address about this. Radiator Springs moved from being in the middle of my room to being up against a back wall, and that's still where it is to this day. It's a lot smaller, more concise, and there is no wiggle room. The buildings are moving all around earlier on in the series. Also, at this point, Sarge's had been replaced with a building that was way too big. Went from way too small to way too big. That happened back in Dannybrook.
Yeah, also, one thing that I do like about this episode is that Lightning, of course, goes after it to get his cup, and in normal series style, it would be he wins after a long, hard race. He wins to get it back, but he actually loses.
Right, he doesn't get it back. He wakes up thinking it was a dream,
which is actually also one of those many interesting things you did this season.
Yeah, he wakes up thinking it was a dream, and Sally was like, "No, it wasn't a dream. You passed out afterwards, and we had to rescue you." I believe Lightning getting his piston cup back is addressed in season 2.
It's in a later season. It's briefly mentioned in a later season, indeed.
Episode 15 is one of the worst ones. It's fully a flashback called Doc's Final Words. On this episode
it's also the first episode where he sees somebody die in Cars Adventures.
Right. On today's episode of Ty does random things that are barely connected. That's what this season is. Every other season is not as loosely connected. Random stuff happens as this. Doc, we see a flashback to Doc's death as he states the stupidest, Lightning, if there comes a time when you have to retire, please train another racer. Dude pulls a Qui-Gon Jinn on Lightning, and I hate it.
Yeah, and then the only relevance it has to the main plot is that Lightning tells Mater why it's so important to him to train someone.
Exactly. And what I hate here is that he says, that's why it's so important for me to train Cruz, or I guess Sally now, or in this case, Sally. It's like, dude, you're saying it's important to you because before Doc died, he said, Lightning, you should train someone in the future. And then Lightning immediately gives up on Cruz because she lost a few times. It's so out of character, especially now if we know it's something that Doc told him to do. And that's an oversight I didn't realize while filming, I guess.
Yeah, well, you have definitely improved since.
Speaking of improvements, let's talk about the opposite of that. Episode 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20 were filmed back, released on the same day as a few other episodes before them, I believe. They were all filmed outside, and they are Sally's First Race, part 1, 2, 3, 4, and final part, where we see just one really long, boring race, which is actually just the cars going downhill in grass, for entirely too long.
Yeah, let's see. I can't even read my notes here.
I can't tell any of the episodes apart.
The first thing first of all, yeah, it's a grass track. It's once again with the main group, except of course not the cars that were in the first race that were supposed to be there. It's just Sally and a bunch of veterans racing against Tim, Danny, and gens. Jackson.
Yeah, at this point, we are at least only using Piston Cup cars. I think at one point in one of these episodes, there are two key moments. The first is when we learn where the other next gens went. Supposedly, there was a fuel famine, which caused a bunch of the next gens to not work so well anymore, and companies were forced to replace them with stock cars, or not stock cars, veterans. I called them stock cars at the time because I was an idiot. They're all stock cars. They were forced to replace them with veteran racers again, which I think in hindsight might be the biggest missed opportunity in the entire Cars Adventure series. That's an interesting concept. The concept that the next gens actually started failing after they were introduced in Cars 3, and so they had to replace them with stock cars. That's honestly very interesting.
Yeah,
but it's never addressed again.
So let me quickly look through my notes. So the first one I had stuff about. There was also something with ciao and something with what is that in French, and I actually thought like this is bonjour or something. No, bonjour is good day. I don't know. My French is not the greatest. Let's see. The episode 17, they addressed like, and it's still in the first lap, and Sally has already moved from the back of the field to the front and back. And it's only the first lap, so the lap is way too long.
They keep calling Sally Cruz by accident, which is just me never taking a second take.
Yeah, and episode 18. One good thing about episode 18 is that Danny actually has some kind of character development in this episode.
What does he do?
Because he's really being really nice and staying at the back of the field, and people are like kind of don't like him because he's not actually trying to race because he wants the stock cars to do. Yeah. And then the stock cars or veterans, just call them stalkers here. They actually convince him to still be near the front to actually try to race against Danny and the others. So
Danny's just so nice now.
That is actually a kind of a nice thing. Not actually do that in a great way, but it's a nice little character development.
One of the episodes starts with Lightning explaining that he decided to fire Cruz because he thought Sally would be better, and that's it. Like we addressed earlier.
It's Lightning confessing to what he did. Yeah.
In the final, as it goes on into part 4, it's like the RPM 500 or 400 or something. So Winford, Bradford, Rutherford is told that, hey, this is your race, you should win. And so he keeps yelling, it's my race! And at the very end of the last part, we have almost a 7-way tie. And then Winford drives through and he yells, it's my race! And he wins.
Yeah, also one more thing. In episode 19, the only thing I've noted down is Porsche is that somebody mentions a Porsche league. Oh, somebody should start that. So I saw that and I immediately remember of the fact that there's actually races out there, a special series for only Porsches called the Porsche Carrera Cup.
I didn't know that, but I
didn't know it at that time. You probably didn't until now, but it actually exists. What you mentioned there.
So, there you go. These episodes all blend together, and it's sad because I feel like before this episode, the season's getting okay, and then all of these, I'd argue they're not as bad as the first few episodes of the season, but these are just...
Yeah, one of my notes here is, why is it 5 episodes long?
Exactly. So, literally almost half the season is that. Then we move into the next 3 episodes 21, 22, and 23, which are just another race, released the next day, because I had so much fun the first time.
The thing that these 3 episodes improve over the last one is that they're actually racing on surface that could be on a racetrack instead of just grass.
We have the Calm Before the Storm, Sally versus the Next Gens, and McQueen back on track. And the Next Gens are just like, oh, we're evil now, or something. No,
it's basically the introduction, the proper beginning of the evil Next Gens, because Tim and Jackson actually have kind of they're sort of working together, but also not really. But they basically, at least we get something with that they actually talked about things before the race.
Yeah, so
they don't keep to those promises, but they actually did. It's actually the start of the evil Next Gens there.
There's literally just a throwaway joke of them being like, yeah, we've started a group on how to stop Sally and the veterans from winning. And we meet on alternating Thursdays, and later on Sally has a joke. She's like, oh yeah, well I'm part of group 2 and we meet on alternating Tuesdays. somehow these throwaway
Yeah,
jokes
well,
became
the
the
group
main
of Sally
conflict.
has a couple of stock cars with it. Actually, Claude Scruggs is pretty. Claude Scruggs and Winford are like the most prominent of the stock cars in this group.
Yeah, for those of you wondering,
Buck Bearingley is part of it as well.
the Cars 3 veterans for these sponsors were not out at the time. Or Bruce was, and he was just in the Amazon exclusive 10-pack. So that's why McQueen back on track is another one of the worst episodes. I remember I thought it was such a cool finale. This is like basically the season finale. There's one episode left, but it's basically the finale as Lightning gets back on track to stop the evil next gens from doing bad
It's
stuff to
Guido.
Sally. And Guido does too. This is the least legal thing ever. But I thought it was so cool. Look, McQueen's jumping onto the track to save everyone. Isn't that awesome? And I remember at the time people didn't like this episode.
Yeah, it's also Guido takes down the next gens. He fixes cars on the middle of the track.
He takes their wheels off, I think.
Yeah, something like that. It is terrible. Also, I'm not sure, it's not this episode, but one of these episodes also introduces the track time tree joke.
Yeah, I think the first part of these three. So yeah, these...
Rex Revel explains that he says, my boss tells me to do it, which is pretty much, it's in my contract.
Yeah. So that's
doesn't say that, but it's pretty much in his contract, which doesn't surprise me.
8 solid episodes of basically nothing. These could have just been one episode each. But yeah, they're fine. I don't think they're as bad as the first few episodes. I'm going to be honest, they're not as bad as I remember them being, but they just take up a big chunk out of the season, and it's just kind of dumb.
I kind of skipped through half of them, so I missed some of the jokes.
Yeah, it's a lot. I wish I had done that. Anyway, the last episode is called Cruise's New Sponsor, Season Finale. And in this episode, this is like the first concept that I think was actually a good concept that I ran with. Throughout this whole season, you have what I think are some pretty fun concepts for episodes or even season-long plots that are immediately just done really poorly. But this, clearly, I knew what I wanted to do. I had a goal going in, and I wanted to use it in the future.
You didn't know where it was going to end up, but you had a good beginning.
Exactly.
You began something which... It started with episode 5 with Cruise's crash, and then actually that was technically the beginning, but this is where it actually begins.
Yeah. So that's sort of the arc of this season is sort of the downfall of Cruise. It's done terribly. You sort of have a Lemon subplot. It doesn't have the typical subplot structure Cars Adventures has now, and we'll see when that starts to take shape. This is just random things happening. Sometimes episodes connect, sometimes they don't really, and you see just... We'll get to this in a minute when we go over our overall thoughts. But yeah, in this episode, Cruz is like depressed in her apartment.
Hold on.
Cruz is depressed in her apartment. And Chick Hicks shows up to recruit Cruz to become the racer sponsoring Chick's Picks with Chick Hicks. Because for whatever reason, he decides that he wants a racer for his TV show. So Cruz accepts his offer, and that's where the season ends.
This is something you would normally put in like a post-credit scene, but it's
only a minute and a half.
It's not bad for us. It's technically not the season finale, but it's not bad. It's a good way to end it.
It's fine. So overall thoughts on the season, that wraps it up. Do you want to go first with overall thoughts? I just have a little paragraph written down. Okay, I'm just gonna read the notes that I wrote for this. So sorry if it repeats something I already said. So in my notes we have... First few episodes are abysmal and a bore to get through. Barely able to hear anything. Stupid and ridiculous plots that make little to no sense. It feels like they're trying... Why did I say there? Sorry, feels like it's trying to do everything. Which I think is my big issue with the season. But it was season 1. It was before I knew what I wanted and before I knew the series would go on for as long as it did. So here is just... doing kind of everything. The Lemon plot is by far the worst offender, but after it, the season gets a bit better with episodes with clearer plots that are a bit more competent. And then the last 10 or so episodes are just racing, and while they aren't as bad as the first 10, they're incredibly boring and there are way too many of them. I also want to throw in good concepts, terrible execution.
Yeah. No, I have not written anything down. I'm just going to say, like, in the first episodes were kind of all over the place, 4 of them taking place on the first day. but they introduced some things which are significant or could have been significant. And yeah, the Rise of the Lemons, I actually kind of like that plot. I don't think it's terrible, but it could have been done better, but it's not the worst. The Demolition Derby episode doesn't fit in, should not exist in my
Yeah.
opinion. And from there on, it gets pretty decent. And then we get the races, which I think the only word that goes for that is boring.
Yeah.
And then the final episode, which we already said, is actually good and the most contributing to ones that contributes the episode that contributes the most to the overall series plot.
Exactly. So, the top 3 lists, I think we should each say our number 3, then our number 2, then our number 1.
Yeah.
Okay.
Should I go first with number 3?
Yeah, go first.
Okay, so mine on number 3, I actually have episode 3, Maynard the Greater Rise Again.
Okay.
I think I already said this to you before. I think it's it doesn't really fit in, even with the episodes around it. It doesn't really fit in, but on its own, it's okay. It's pretty okay.
Mine
And being okay on your own is already a huge plus for this season. So,
exactly. My number 3 is Cruz's new job. This one actually has a story with a start and an end. It has some awkward carryover from the last episode with Cruz getting unmodified. I feel like some of these scenes could have been in the episode before, but the concept of Cruz working fast food is funny enough. And this is just one of the more decent offerings of the season, I think.
Yeah, so for the second place, I'm actually gonna go with episode 8, Rise of the Lemons Part 2, because it's actually just, it's kind of just with those days, and it's probably the best of the Rise of the Lemons episodes, in my opinion.
Yeah,
it is, because it's on my top 3. It's sort of just, it's not a single episode that tries to do something crazy, it's just continuing the story from a previous episode.
For me, number 2 is Mater the Greater Rides Again.
Okay, so you also have your top 3.
Yeah, this one is just fun. I think it's funny. It's cringy, but I honestly think it is kind of funny. And I just like the concept of Mater just messing with everyone by doing stupid stunts that just kind of damage their property. I wish I had done a little more with it, but the ending with Lightning having to go up and save him, I think, is also a funny concept.
Yeah, it's just how he lands doesn't make sense, but that's another thing.
He shouldn't be alive. And what's your number 1?
My number 1 is episode 24 for reasons we've already stated.
Mine is also episode 24.
Well, we know what is the best which episode is the best of the season.
And it's sad because it's only a minute and a half, and yeah, it's basically a glorified credit scene, but that's everything that it needs.
It's the episode that sets up the rest of the series, pretty much.
Yeah. So there you have it. Those are our thoughts on the first season of Cars Adventures. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. We are now going to suffer through the next season.
I don't remember season 2 as well, but I do know it has one of, if not the worst episodes in the entire series, so I'm very excited. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. Thank you to Robin for joining me, and I will see you guys next time. Bye now.